The Most Dangerous Man in America, Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, movie review. So this is a review of a documentary. It's a fascinating documentary, and as always, to be perfectly honest, your time is going to be much better spent actually watching the thing than watching me talk about it. I mean, I hate to say it, but it's true. At the moment, it's on YouTube. I'll leave a link in the description down below, so just stop watching me and then go and watch the documentary. It is well worth your time. It's possible that actually the link below is going to expire after a certain amount of time, you know, like the copyright bots will get it or something. So if that's the case, I've noticed over the past 10 years that this movie tends to pop up in YouTube in random places, like it's always on YouTube somewhere, or that seems to have been the pattern over the past 10 years. So if it's not at the link below, just search YouTube. Chances are you can find it somewhere. If by some chance it manages to get completely wiped off of YouTube, then do your best to track it down, because this documentary is really worth it. I guess that being said, I'm going to go ahead and do my review, because that's what I do here on this channel. So you've been warned. Your time is better spent actually watching the real documentary than watching me talk about it, but here I go. I'm going to talk about it. I think it might be useful to give the historical background behind this story before I get into it, because some people might not know. If you already know this, bear with me, or better yet, listen to it and then maybe fact check me in the comment section down below, because, you know, I'm not an expert. I might get things wrong. But the Pentagon Papers refers to a report on the Vietnam War that was commissioned by Secretary McNamara during the Johnson administration. And it was intended to be for internal use only. So it was, you know, the Pentagon making a report about what they thought the history of the Vietnam War was for their internal use. And it was never supposed to be seen by the American public. In fact, it was classified as top secret because they were being a little bit too honest with what happened. They're trying to honestly assess what had happened for the purposes of making policy. It got leaked by Daniel Ellsberg in, I forget, 1970 or 1971. I forget exactly. And became a media sensation after that. Then at the point it got leaked, the media story became more about the leaking of the papers and the legal battle behind it, rather than the contents of the papers. So initially it was leaked to the New York Times. The New York Times began publishing the Pentagon Papers. The Nixon administration went to court to get a court order to stop the New York Times from publishing, and then it was like this legal battle. Does the New York Times have the right to publish it, or can the government stop them from publishing it? Other newspapers then got a hold of the Pentagon Papers, and so then, you know, several court orders had to be sent out. And then Daniel Ellsberg, of course, was on trial for leaking government secrets and was facing a lengthy prison sentence. And so all that drama about the legal drama between the newspapers and the legal drama between Daniel Ellsberg tended to be what dominated the news. And I think that is what people often talk about when they talk about the Pentagon Papers, is they talk about that legal drama more than they talk about what's actually inside the papers. For better or for worse, I think that's a fault of this documentary as well. I mean, I love this documentary. I will sing its praises in a moment. But I did feel that after having finished the documentary, I didn't really have any better idea of what the actual contents of the Pentagon Papers were before I started watching the documentary. And I think it's important. I think it's especially important because, I don't know, I mean, tell me how this compares with your experience, but when I was in high school, you know, we studied the Vietnam War in history class, and the Pentagon Papers never came up. So, you know, at no point did the history teacher say, oh, and by the way, turns out these papers were released in 1971 that proved that the whole war was based on lies right from the beginning. I don't know, what was your experience like in history school? Because I hate to overgeneralize from my own anecdotal experience, but I'm thinking that this doesn't get taught in history classes. I found out about it in university, and not from the professors, but just from outside reading during university, which I suspect is where most people find out about it. And by most people, I mean people who were born after 1971, you know, people who were too young to have actually lived through this. So I looked it up on Wikipedia, and my basic understanding after having read the Wikipedia article is that, I mean, the Pentagon Papers is absolutely huge. I think it's 7,000 pages, which is why probably most people only have a fuzzy idea of what they actually contain, because who's actually read all 7,000 pages, right? But yeah, apparently the main points, according to Wikipedia, was, according to the Pentagon Papers, it was revealed for the first time that the U.S. had been actively involved in Vietnam long before the American government admitted it to the public. We've been involved all the way since the 1950s. Kennedy was planning a larger war and committing more troops than he ever admitted to the U.S. Public. The other big thing, and again according to Wikipedia, is Pentagon Papers revealed that South Vietnam was essentially just something the U.S. created. Because, you know, like the politicians and everybody would always be like, we have to defend South Vietnam, we must protect South Vietnam, unfair aggression against South Vietnam. But what they never made clear is there was no South Vietnam, really. Like, it didn't exist before the U.S. created it. The Vietnamese didn't view themselves as North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese. The people who lived within the borders of South Vietnam did not have a strong national identity of we're South Vietnamese. And the government that was installed in Saigon really had no support among the Vietnamese people. They were very indifferent to the government in Saigon at best, or they were fighting against it at worst. And this was never conveyed to the American people, that the government of South Vietnam was essentially a U.S. creation. Diem, the president of South Vietnam, was overthrown by a coup, which the Kennedy administration knew of and approved of, and this was also in the Pentagon Papers. The military operations in South Vietnam were much larger, and from the very beginning the U.S. government knew that this would require much more troops than they told to the American people. So, you know, you had Johnson and McNamara going on, talking to the reporters and say, yes, 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 we're winning, we're winning, we're winning. And all the time that they knew that they were losing and that they would need many more troops than they were actually being forthright with the American people. There were excursions into Cambodia and Laos to fight the Viet Cong that the American people were not told about. And there was some excursions on the coast of North Vietnam that the American people were not told about. And that, as far as memory serves, I think is the bulk of the damning information in the Pentagon Papers. By all means, somebody correct me if I'm getting something wrong or if I'm leaving out something vital. Yeah. So this documentary, my main criticism of it is that it didn't go into more detail about what was in the Pentagon Papers. That list I rattled off, I got mostly from Wikipedia. Some of it did come from the documentary. Oh, the other thing that was interesting in the documentary is they talked about how the Gulf of Tonkin was essentially fabricated. I mean, there was an incident, but then it turned out that the U.S. intelligence concluded that actually that incident was a non-incident. Nothing actually happened. But Johnson still used the Gulf of Tonkin to get funding for the war because he had already decided before that happened that he was just waiting for an excuse to get into the war. This was mentioned in the documentary because Daniel Ellsberg was involved in it. He was like on the ground gathering intelligence when the Gulf of Tonkin happened. I don't believe that that was in the Pentagon Papers. The fact that the Gulf of Tonkin had been fabricated. It was, again, I'm not sure about this, so somebody let me know if I'm getting it wrong. I think it was in the documentary because Ellsberg was involved with it. So it was in the documentary about Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, but I'm not sure if that incident was part of what was released during the Pentagon Papers. Interestingly enough, while I'm on the subject, that Ken Burns documentary about the Vietnam War, which came out a couple years ago, everybody remember that one? In that documentary, they actually played the Gulf of Tonkin like it was an actual military incident, something that happened, like an actual attack by the North Vietnamese. I had been under the impression, in part because of this documentary and in part because of, other things I had seen and read, that the consensus was nothing happened in the Gulf of Tonkin, like that U.S. soldiers had been shooting at fish or something. Something was on the radar screen, but it turned out to have been nothing. I don't know. Again, somebody let me know down in the comments if you know more about this. Was the Ken Burns documentary right? Was there actually an attack in the Gulf of Tonkin, or was this documentary right? The one about Daniel Ellsberg, and it was fabricated. I don't know. Okay. Anyways, this documentary focuses more on the story of Daniel Ellsberg. It follows him on his journey from hawk to dove on the Vietnam War, because to give credit where credit is due, this was a very interesting thing that the documentary did. Is he had started off as one of the people who was supporting the war, and then it shows how he became disillusioned with the war over the period because of the information he was getting. Also explains the risks he took and why he took them, and as such, it is a great piece of storytelling. My main criticism is that it doesn't actually go into more detail about what actually was in the Pentagon Papers itself. It's interesting because at one point in the documentary, Howard Zinn, who was one of the frequent commenters on this documentary, mentions that the media circus around the Pentagon Papers caused quite a stir, but the content of the Pentagon Papers was never fully absorbed by the public. It's ironic he makes that comment in this documentary, because this documentary is guilty of the same thing, focusing on the media sensation and not the content. But again, there were some interesting things in this documentary. One interesting thing is that Daniel Ellsberg was good friends with Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky, which I didn't know about. And this was even before Daniel Ellsberg became a media sensation by releasing the Pentagon Papers. In fact, it's said in the documentary, Howard Zinn was talking about how during the 1971 May Day anti-war protest in Washington, the three of them, Noam Chomsky, Daniel Ellsberg, and Howard Zinn, were apparently an affinity group, which, in protest terms is like a group of people who are watching out for each other. I mean, imagine those three guys hanging out together. I mean, what I wouldn't have given to be a fly on the wall listening to the conversation between Daniel Ellsberg, Howard Zinn, and Noam Chomsky as they're all at this protest together. But yeah, so that's another one of the interesting things I got from this documentary. Another thing that was interesting was some of the clips from the Nixon tapes. Now, I don't believe that this documentary was the first one to unearth these tapes. I mean, it was the first place I had heard them. But I assume they had already been in the public domain and had already been around. But I had never heard this before watching this documentary, and it is shocking. For example, you have a tape of Kissinger and Nixon talking about the bombings. And Nixon angrily exclaims to Kissinger, "You're so goddamned concerned about the civilians, and I don't give a damn. I don't care." which is shocking on so many levels. It's difficult to know even where to begin. I mean, yeah, I mean, wow. So here is Nixon saying he doesn't care at all about the civilians in Vietnam. And, you know, given Nixon's bombing campaign, it's very easy to see where this is played out. So this is essentially murder. Just this indiscriminate bombing of civilians when he's saying on tape, I don't give a damn. I don't care. I'm not sure if I'm the right person to unpack this quote, because I tend to be a little bit rambling and inarticulate, but it's worth unpacking by somebody. I mean, it just illustrates how if you kill somebody on the street, it's murder, but if you become if a government does it, it's just policy. And you know, I don't think Nixon was pure evil. I mean, I think he was a complicated man. But this act of indiscriminately bombing civilians and just saying, I don't care, I don't give a damn, is illustrative of pure evil. Yeah, and that's our history. And that's something that's got to be grappled with. And then there's another quote when Nixon again is talking to Kissinger about bombing. This is separate. This is later in the documentary. Nixon says, and I still think we ought to take the dikes out now. Will that drown people? And Kissinger says, about 200,000 people. And Nixon says, no, I'd rather use the nuclear bomb. Have you got that, Henry? And Kissinger says, I think that would be just too much. And Nixon says, the nuclear bomb, does that bother you? I just want you to think big, Henry, for Christ's sakes. Now, obviously, we know from history that the nuclear bomb was not dropped on Vietnam. But yeah, I mean, that just illustrates the callous disregard for life that these guys have. And you know, this wasn't like to protect America from Vietnam, right? This was a country we had no business being in, and a war we had created. There's no point in me explaining the obvious here. We're all aware of the implications of this quote. It's just shocking. Yeah. So, anyways, this documentary is, I think, is important. I think it's something everybody should see, and it's something you want to see. It's a fascinating story. Highly recommend it. Please check it out.